Howdy everybody, this is Dr. Thomas Coyle again. Welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. In this lecture, I'm going to continue our discussion of language and language development, focusing on two theories of language development, and those are learning theory and nativism, and can be seen on the current overhead. Both of these theories attempt to explain how kids learn a language, and therefore are basically theories of language acquisition. That explain how kids learn a language. Kids aren't born into the world knowing a language. They don't come out of the womb at birth being able to speak, obviously. They have to acquire a language over time. And both learning theory and nativism make certain assumptions about how kids acquire a language over time and eventually learn to speak a language like a full-blown adult speaker. So I'm going to be focusing on theories of language development that attempt to explain language acquisition, or how kids acquire a language. And I'll be talking about the two theories of language development that are noted on the overhead: learning theory and nativism. Now, for each of these theories, I'll first mention the key assumption associated with the theory, and then I'll provide some elaborations for each theory, focusing on support for the theory and problems with the theory. Okay, so let's begin with learning theory. That's the first theory. By the way, I don't have it here, but learning theory is most closely associated with B.F. Skinner. You might remember the name B.F. Skinner in the previous lecture on theories of development, where we talked about learning theory, as well as other theories. Well, learning theory is back now in the current lecture, except that learning theory here is going to focus on language acquisition, and attempt to explain how kids acquire a language, okay, over time. The key assumption of learning theory is that kids acquire a language through reinforcement and punishment, just like they would acquire any other type of behavior or mental process. Again, key assumption of learning theory is that kids acquire a language through reinforcement and punishment. Learning theory assumes that kids are rewarded or reinforced for speaking correctly, for using grammatically correct speech, for example. And learning theory also assumes that kids are punished for speaking incorrectly, for using grammatically incorrect utterances, saying things like, I go to the store, which is clearly incorrect grammatically, or the mans went to the store. The mans, by the way, is also grammatically correct. The plural of man is not mans, but is men, M-E-N. Okay, so again, the key assumption of learning theory is that kids learn a language through reinforcement and punishment. Learning theory assumes that parents and other people reinforce kids for speaking correctly and using, for example, grammatically correct utterances, saying the man went to the store instead of the man go to the store. And learning theory assumes that parents and other people punish kids for speaking incorrectly, at least in terms of adult standards, and using incorrect speech, saying things like the man's goed to the store, which is incorrect. Again, the child should not say the man's go to the store, but should say the men went to the store. Man's is grammatically incorrect. The plural of man is not mans, but is men, M-E-N. And goed is clearly incorrect. The past tense of to go is not goed, but went. Okay? To repeat, learning theory assumes that kids learn a language through reinforcement and punishment. It further assumes that parents and other people reward or reinforce kids for speaking correctly and using grammatically correct statements, and that parents and other people punish kids for speaking incorrectly and using grammatically incorrect statements, which would reduce the frequency of grammatically incorrect statements if kids are punished. Okay, so that's the assumption. Again, assumptions can be correct or incorrect. Assumptions can be valid or invalid. Is there any support for the assumptions of learning theory? There is, in short, and this brings me to the next point, labeled support, and in parentheses, word-object associations. Support for learning theory comes from studies of word-object associations. Word-object associations occur when a kid associates a word with a particular object. Okay. For example, a word-object association would occur when a kid learns to associate the word dog with the four-legged animal of a dog, okay, and the word cat with the four-legged animal of a cat. There is support for learning theory from studies of word-object associations. It's clear that parents and other people reinforce young kids for associating the correct word with a particular object, that is, calling a dog or a cat. And it's also clear that parents and other people punish kids for incorrectly associating a word with a particular object, which would occur, for example, when kids call a cat a dog, which is obviously incorrect, or call a dog a cat, the reverse, which is also incorrect. Parents would punish that. By the way, punish in this case simply means that parents are telling the kid that no, the cat is not called a dog, the cat is called a cat. That's punishment. That's punishment in this case. Remember, punishment refers to any consequence that's intended to decrease a behavior or an event in the future. In this case, parents are just correcting the kid verbally in an attempt to decrease the likelihood that a kid is going to mislabel a dog or a cat in the future. Okay? All right, so there is support for learning theory from studies of word-object associations. However, there's also a problem with learning theory, and it's a big problem with learning theory. The problem is that kids, young kids in particular, often say grammatically correct things that they have not learned from their parents and could not, in general, have learned from other people. And therefore, were not reinforced, but nonetheless say these things. And in particular, kids say things like the mans go to the store quite frequently early in development, even though their parents are not reinforcing kids for saying such things, which are clearly grammatically correct. And indeed, and ironically, parents really rarely correct or punish kids for saying those things either. Yet kids say grammatically correct things like the man goes to the store all the time when they're learning to speak a language. Those statements are clearly grammatically incorrect, yet young kids say them. As I'll mention later on, one theory is that young kids say them because they're learning general rules of syntax, such as adding s to a common noun makes it plural, or adding ed to a common verb makes it past tense. But they're overextending these syntactic rules to irregular cases, and therefore making grammatical errors like the ones you see in parentheses there. Learning theory can't explain those grammatically incorrect statements. Parents don't reinforce them, of course, and in reality, parents rarely punish them, yet kids say things like that all the time. So there must be other explanations of language development, of language acquisition that can explain grammatically incorrect statements like the one in parentheses there. And this brings me to nativism, which is a theory, another theory of language development that has been used to explain grammatically incorrect statements like the ones you see there. Okay, so I'm going to focus for probably the next 20 or so minutes on nativism, which is another theory of language development that has received a lot of attention recently, and that is commonly associated with Chomsky. Chomsky's full name is Noam Chomsky. Chomsky is a famous linguist at MIT who was instrumental in creating the theory of nativism and the assumptions behind nativism. So I'm going to go over nativism in just a moment. I'll follow the same approach here that I followed for learning theory. I'll highlight the key assumptions of nativism first, and then I'll talk about Chomsky's LAD. LAD, as I'll say in a moment, stands for Language Acquisition Device, which is used to help kids learn syntax. I'll go over that in a moment. First, assumptions, meaning the key assumptions of nativism here. The key assumptions of nativism is that the ability to learn a language is innate and is biologically determined. Again, the key assumptions of nativism is that the ability to learn a language is innate and biologically determined. Okay. First, innate, that's a single word. What does innate mean? Innate, in this context, innate means that kids are born into the world with the ability to learn a language without having to receive any formal training or instruction to learn a language. All they need is exposure to the language. Again, in this context, innate means that kids are born into the world with the ability to learn a language without having to receive formal instruction to learn a language, and only have to be exposed to a language in their natural environment, exposed to a language from their parents or peers or other in their surroundings, okay? As I'll mention in a moment, there is some evidence that the ability to learn a language is innate, and that kids are born into the world with the ability to learn a language just by being exposed to a language and don't have to be formally instructed to learn a language, say in a classroom. Most of this evidence comes from the fact that kids throughout the world who are exposed to a language in everyday environments from parents and peers do learn to speak a language, okay? Do learn to speak fluently, so long as they're exposed to it. There have been some very rare cases of individuals that I'll get to who are reared in almost complete isolation without being exposed to a language, and those kids do have problems learning the language. But most normal healthy kids obviously aren't reared in complete isolations, but are exposed to a language in their everyday environment from their parents, peers, other people, and do learn to speak a language fluently. And therefore, the assumption is that language is innate, and that the ability to learn a language is present in all normal healthy kids who only have to be exposed to a language in everyday life in order to learn it, and do not need to receive formal instruction from a teacher in order to learn how to speak a language. Okay, so that's one part of the key assumption. The key assumption of nativism, again, was that the ability to learn a language is innate. The other part of the assumption was that the ability to learn a language is biologically determined. Two words, biologically determined. Biologically determined here means that the ability to learn a language is related to the brain, okay, and specifically to certain parts of the brain that are associated with language. And on the next overhead, we'll get to a discussion of certain parts of the brain that are associated with the ability to speak a language, and also the ability to understand a language and comprehend a language, okay? Those parts of the brain are called Broca's area, which is associated with the ability to produce or speak a language, and Wernicke's area, which is associated with the ability to comprehend or understand a language. And I'll cover those on the next overhead. I'm mentioning them now as support for the assumption that language is biologically determined, at least in part, and is associated with certain regions of the brain related to language. Okay, so those are the key assumptions of nativism, that the ability to learn a language is 1, innate, and 2, biologically determined. All right. Another an important concept related to nativism is Chomsky's LAD. Chomsky, again, is the person most commonly associated with nativism. Chomsky created the concept of an LAD to help explain how kids learn syntax. LAD is an abbreviation, as I said, for language acquisition device. Again, LAD is an abbreviation for language acquisition device. According to Chomsky, an LAD is a module in the brain that helps kids learn syntax. Again, according to Chomsky, an LAD, or language acquisition device, is a module in the brain that helps kids learn a language. It helps kids specifically learn syntax. Okay, syntax is in parentheses there to highlight it. You might recall that syntax refers to the rules for ordering or sequencing linguistic units in a language, for ordering the sounds that make up words, and for ordering words that make up sentences, okay? I put on the overhead some examples of syntax that presumably are facilitated by the LAD, the language acquisition device. So one example of a syntactical rule is that adding s to regular nouns makes the nouns plural. Adding s to dog makes dogs, which is the plural of dog. A second syntactical rule is that adding ed to regular verbs makes them past tense verbs. So adding ed to walk makes walk, which is the past tense of walk, referring to something that happened in the past. Okay, Chomsky argues that all kids are born with an LAD in their brain, and that the LAD language acquisition device is an innate module in the brain that helps kids learn syntax. So I snuck in an innate. Again, the LAD is an innate module in the brain that helps kids learn syntax, such as the syntactical rules that I mentioned a moment ago and that are on the bottom of the overhead there. Okay, so that covers some general characteristics of nativism. What I want to do next, yes, is cover the items on the next overhead, which focus on evidence for nativism. You see the title Evidence for Nativism is at the very top of the overhead. And what I have on this overhead is various lines of evidence in support of nativism. And I'd like to cover 5 points in particular that are all on the overhead, and that begin with all healthy infants learn a language and progress with certain aspects of language are universal, and languages related to the brain, over-regularizations, and then finally critical periods. So all of these points represent evidence in support of nativism, in support of the idea that the ability to learn a language is innate and present from birth, and helps allows kids to learn a language as long as they're exposed to a language without any formal training or instruction. Okay. Okay, so let's begin with them. Let's begin with the first item. All healthy infants learn a language is the first piece of evidence in support of nativism. This is true. All healthy infants learn a language as long as they're exposed to a language in everyday life from their parents, peers, and other people, which is the case for all normal healthy infants who are reared with parents in a home environment and who are not reared in isolation, which would of course not be a normal, healthy environment. There are some cases of people, young kids in particular, who are reared in almost complete isolation for the first 12 or so years of life and who were not exposed to a language or who were exposed to only limited amounts of language and who had trouble with language. But all normal, healthy infants learn a language as long as they're exposed to a language from parents, peers, and other people in their environment, okay? Which suggests that the ability to learn a language is innate, and that kids don't need to be taught to learn a language. All they need to be is exposed to the language in the home environment, okay? Second point is that, or second piece of evidence in support of nativism, is that certain aspects of language are universal. Universal here means that certain aspects of language are found for kids throughout the world, kids in industrialized countries like our own, as well as developing countries that don't have modern industry and that don't have formal schooling, okay? And one aspect of language that is universal is the sequence of stages that kids go through in language development in the first year of life. In the first year of life, kids go through a reliable sequence of stages in language development on their way to producing one-word utterances. I mentioned these before when we talked about factors that influence development. The sequence of stages that's observed for kids throughout the world in the first year of life begins with cooing, followed by babbling, and then one-word utterances. And all these stages of language development occur in the first year of life. Let me go through them briefly. They're in parentheses there. I mentioned them before, but I'll mention them again and elaborate a little bit. Cooing is the first stage of language development. Cooing occurs when young infants, typically around 4 months of age, show evidence of long vowel utterances. Cooing refers to long vowel utterances that are typically produced by young infants around 4 months of age, 4 months of age, okay? I misspoke, I think, a moment ago. 4 months of age, cooing is observed. Cooing, again, refers to long vowel utterances, such as oh or ah, okay? O or ah, O being a vowel, A being a vowel, okay? Infants who show signs of cooing are showing a rudimentary form of using phonemes. Phonemes, remember, are small units of sound that ultimately can be combined to form words and sentences. The next stage is babbling. The next stage after cooing is babbling. Babbling refers to consonant vowel repetitions in infants, consonant vowel repetitions that an infant makes, such as ba ba ba, or ka ka ka, or da da da. Ba, ba, ba is B-A, B-A, B-A. That's a consonant vowel repetition. Da, 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 D-A, D-A, D-A. Another consonant vowel repetition. Ga, 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 G-A, G-A, G-A. Yet another one. Some people, some language scientists view babbling as an infant's attempt to experiment with language, to experiment with phonemes of language that can ultimately be combined to form words, okay? And then finally, after babbling comes the last stage of language development that I'd like to mention in the first year of life, one-word utterances, which usually occurs around the end of the first year of life. In this stage, infants finally produce their first real words, saying mama or dada or yes or no as it happens, okay? But they're producing one-word utterances by the end of the first year after cooing and babbling. So all infants throughout the world, even deaf infants, believe it or not, go through those three stages reliably, beginning with cooing, followed by babbling, followed by one-word utterances within the first year of life, suggesting that certain aspects of language are universal, which is consistent with the idea that language learning is innate. If language learning is innate, then you would expect certain aspects of language to be universal. And indeed, you find that the stages of language development in the first year of life are universal, beginning with cooing, followed by babbling, and finally by one-word utterances. Okay. So that covers the second point. The third point is that, or third piece of evidence in support of nativism is that language is related to the brain, and specifically to certain regions of the brain associated with language. So there's no doubt that language is related to the brain. We know this from modern neuroimaging studies, and we also know this from neuropsychological studies where people receive brain damage due to an accident or due to a disease and have damage to certain areas of the brain that affect their ability to produce language or their ability to comprehend language. And I'd like to talk about two areas of the brain that are associated with language, certain aspects of language. In particular, they're associated either with the ability to produce language or the ability to comprehend language. And the two areas I'd like to key in on and focus on are Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Then I'll talk about aphasias afterwards. So these are Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the two areas I'll be talking about. Both of these areas are areas in the brain that are associated with certain aspects of language development. Let's begin with Broca's area. Broca's area is located in general, for most people, located in the left frontal lobe, sort of, you can imagine it being sort of right behind your forehead off to the left area, okay? Broca's area is important because it's associated with speech production. I have that in parentheses. Broca's area is associated with speech production, which refers to the ability to produce speech, as I'm producing now for you in this lecture, okay? We know this because, I'll mention this in a moment, people with damage to Broca's area due to an accident, due to disease, have trouble producing speech. Either they can't produce speech at all, or they speak in a stuttering and stammering manner, okay, and can't get out a full sentence without halting in their speech. So Broca's area, again, is associated with speech production and is located in the left frontal lobe. Wernicke's area is the other area of the brain also associated with language. Wernicke's area is generally associated in the left temporal lobe of people, okay? That's sort of the area of the brain that's right above your left ear behind your skull, okay? The left temporal lobe. And Wernicke's area is associated with speech comprehension, or the ability to comprehend or understand speech. It's important, again. Wernicke's area is associated with speech comprehension, or the ability to comprehend speech that you're hearing, or understand speech that you're hearing, such as the speech you're hearing right now and listening to my lecture right now, okay? And we know that, again, because people with damage to Wernicke's area show comprehension deficits and have trouble understanding or comprehending speech. And with that in mind, we can talk about aphasias. Aphasia is the next item on the overhead, aphasia simply refers to a language disorder. That's all it is. An aphasia is a language disorder. And there are two types of aphasias that I want to mention here because they're related to Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And those two types of aphasias are sensibly called Broca's aphasia on one hand and Wernicke's aphasia on the other. These are two distinct types of aphasia. They're in parentheses there. I'd like to go through them. Broca's aphasia is the first one. Broca's aphasia occurs when a patient receives damage to the left frontal lobe and results in speech production deficits. Again, Broca's aphasia occurs when a patient receives damage to the left frontal lobe, which results in speech production deficits in the ability to produce speech in a smooth and gradual and fluent manner. Okay, people with Broca's aphasia have damage to the left frontal lobe generally and are not able to produce speech fluently, if at all. They speak in a halting, broken manner. Okay, that's Broca's aphasia. The other type of aphasia is Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia occurs when patients have damage to the left temporal lobe in general, which results in speech comprehension deficits, deficits in the ability to comprehend or understand speech that you're hearing from other people, okay? Patients with Wernicke's aphasia have damage, again, to the left temporal lobe and have trouble understanding speech that they're hearing, okay? Have trouble comprehending speech that they're hearing. Those are two types of aphasia. We know these two types of aphasia exist because people with damage to the specific regions of the brain indicated in each type of aphasia show the specific deficits indicated in each type of aphasia. Incidentally, this is just a side note, note that the names of the aphasia are Broca's aphasia on one hand, Wernicke's aphasia on the other. Each type of aphasia is named after the person who discovered it and who first named it. So Broca's aphasia was discovered by Paul Broca, who first characterized it, the aphasia, and noted it, and therefore it was named after him. And Wernicke's aphasia, obviously, was discovered by and characterized by Wernicke, and so Wernicke's aphasia was named after him. Okay, so language is related to the brain is yet another piece of evidence in support of nativism. This evidence in support of nativism is consistent with the assumption that parts of language are biologically determined and biologically based, meaning related to the brain. And there's ample evidence that certain aspects of language are related to the brain, notably related to Broca's area or Wernicke's area, and the aphasias that were just named. Okay, so that's the third point. Fourth point, over-regularizations. Over-regularizations. In this context, over-regularizations occur when a kid overextends a grammatical rule to an irregular case. I'll repeat that. Over-regularizations occur when a kid extends a grammatical rule to an irregular case or applies a grammatical rule to an irregular case. Over-regularizations are a type of grammatical error. Kids who show over-regularizations are showing evidence of a grammatical error. And over-regularizations would occur, for example, when a young kid says the word goed instead of went, or says the word mans instead of men, M-E-N, okay? Kids who say goed or kids who say mans are showing evidence of over-regularizations. That is, they are applying a grammatical rule to an irregular case. In the case of goed, the kid is adding ed to the verb to go, creating goed, which of course is a grammatical error because the kid should say went. In the case of mans, the kid is adding an s to the word man, creating mans, which is also grammatically incorrect. The kid should say men, okay? Now, young kids make these errors, these grammatical errors, these over-regularizations all the time when they're learning how to speak a language. They eventually overcome these grammatical errors and learn to speak correctly in listening to their parents. But these errors are made commonly. And Chomsky attributed these errors, these grammatical errors in part to the language acquisition device. The idea was that kids were learning a grammatical rule here that normally applies for regular nouns and regular verbs, but we're applying it incorrectly, okay? Eventually, over time, kids will learn to apply these rules correctly only in the cases where they're applicable, all right? And these over-regularizations are universal. They happen for kids in any country or culture when kids are first learning to speak a language. They show evidence of over-regularizations. They apply grammatical rules to irregular cases, at least initially. Okay, it's the fourth line of evidence in support of nativism. Fifth line of evidence, and the final one I'd like to cover, is evidence for critical periods in language development, and in particular, critical periods in the ability to learn a second language after already learning your first language or your native language. Your first language is often called your native language. I'll use that terminology because it's often used in research and language development. First, a key concept is a critical period here. A critical period in development refers to a period in development when a particular event must occur in order for development to proceed normally. Critical period is a period in development when a particular event must occur in order for development to proceed normally, in order for development to progress normally. It's assumed, by the way, that a critical period in language development is the period from birth to puberty. It's assumed that kids must learn to speak a language or a second language from birth to puberty in order to speak that language fluently and be regarded as a native language speaker who hasn't learned to speak the second language later on in life, okay? So critical period is a period in development when a particular event must occur in order for development to proceed normally or to progress normally. It's assumed that a critical period in language development exists. Specifically, it's assumed that a critical period in language development is between birth and puberty when kids must learn to speak a language or learn a second language in order to speak the language fluently and be regarded by others as a native language speaker, okay? So I have below before puberty and after puberty. If kids learn a language before puberty, the assumption is that kids are generally able to speak that language fluently and be regarded by others as a native language speaker. In contrast, if kids learn to speak a language or second language after puberty, they typically show significant trouble learning the language, okay? It takes them a longer time to learn it, and are rarely regarded as a native language speaker by other people. Okay, so those are assumptions, by the way. I sort of characterize them as declarative statements. They're really assumptions about language development and about whether kids should be able to learn a language or a second language easily. Again, the general assumption is that kids should be able to learn a second language more easily before puberty and be able to speak it fluently if they learn it before puberty. In contrast, the assumption is that kids should have more difficulty learning a language or a second language after puberty and have more trouble learning a language after puberty and be able to speak it less fluently after puberty. Okay, those are the assumptions.